Hello, I'm Dr. Ray Molstock, a lecturer in the University at Albany's program in Writing and Critical Inquiry and director of the C.H.A.T.S Film Festival and Lecture Series. The 8th annual C.H.A.T.S Film Festival and Lecture Series is presented by UAlbany's Center for the Humanities, Arts, and Technosciences, the UAlbany Libraries, and the New York State Writers Institute, with help from the Writing and Critical Inquiry AI Committee and the Alumni Association. Our film festival and lecture series is an interdisciplinary, student and community-centered public humanities program that aims to generate conversations and cultivate community relationships through a selection of culturally diverse films and lectures that expand academic discourse beyond the classroom and foster critical inquiry into real-world concerns through the arts. Our theme for 2023 is derived from the current discussions of artificial intelligence in culture and the arts. While academics reel and tech companies celebrate, the C.H.A.T.S Film Festival and Lecture Series explores the shifting and significant place of AI in the arts, not just in the products of AI or the production technologies that they bring to film sets, but also the cinematic thrillers, mysteries, romances, and horror that inspired the nightmares and fantasies of where AI can lead us. The lectures and films screened and discussed at the 2023 festival raise questions about loving, learning, working, and living with AI in both extraordinary and mundane circumstances. Artificial intelligence represents the capacity for humankind to imagine a future augmented by machines, a merger of the intrinsically human with the emphatically artificial, so that the boundaries between them become blurred. This year's festival explores these rich liminal spaces for the fears and fantasies that they represent, all the while celebrating what it is that makes humanity unable to be replicated. I'm here today with Dr. Naomi S. Barron, a Guggenheim Fellow, Fulbright Fellow, and Professor Emerita of Linguistics at American University. Since at least 2008, Dr. Barron has been publishing books that identify and investigate the challenges to the classic understandings of reading, writing, and language in an increasingly digital world. Her newest book, just published a few months ago in 2023, is Who Wrote This? How AI and the Lure of Efficiency Threaten Human Writing. Dr. Barron, thank you for joining us in this digital branch of the C.H.A.T.S Film Festival and Lecture Series.
Thank you for having me.
We're very excited to talk to you. So let's start with some not so simple definitions. We can't help but notice that there's a difference between AI as we've imagined it since antiquity, especially in our science fictions, and AI as we have it today, appearing in algorithms, large language models, even chess or Go programs. Can you speak for a moment about the differences and similarities between these two types of artificial intelligence?
If you go back to the work of someone like Isaac Asimov, and there were some movies made, but there were some books first, he envisioned all sorts of possible things. And I'm thinking particularly at the moment of robots that we thought, come on, Isaac, this is never going to be. But what has happened is, to some extent, works of literature and works of cinema have inspired, or comics, have inspired us to say, maybe we could do this kind of thing. So if you want to talk about boundaries between what has been imagined in the literary cinematographic world and what's real AI today, you have to ask, where did people get some of their inspiration? So it's not so simple to just draw lines. When you think about artificial intelligence as a discipline, it began, at least in name, in the late 1950s, but it didn't mean much because there weren't computers, there wasn't the hardware, and there wasn't the software for us to create the sorts of, for example, natural language processing or natural language generation, think these days of ChatGPT, that today we associate with sophisticated artificial intelligence. So to some extent, it's been a buildup of the infrastructure, by which I mean the algorithms, the software, and the hardware capabilities that have made possible an awful lot of things we dreamt about 50, 60, 70 years ago.
I'm so glad you mentioned Asimov. I, Robot was the book that changed my personal point of view about what technology can mean in terms of how we define what humanity means. Robbie, in particular, and Liar were the two stories that really stuck with me. Now, you know, decades, several decades of thinking about those stories, seeing the Twilight Zone episodes, inspired by them,
Yeah.
um, watching Star Trek. And I just taught the Measure of a Man, the episode when Data is on trial for his sentience. And thinking about that in relation to the moment in your book where you ask ChatGPT about its own creativity.
Yes.
And ChatGPT uses the I pronoun, which to me is utterly fascinating because self-reflection and consciousness are, at least in the Star Trek world, um, requirements for sentience. ChatGPT might not be there yet, but it does seem to have a sense of its own I. Am I just
OpenAI was smart enough to know that if they would use a first person pronoun, they would make the users of their tool feel maybe it is sort of sentient. All right. So let's talk about sentience, if we might. There's been a whole lot of discussion about whether any of the large language models, and this goes back to a really scary moment when one software engineer said, I think this is sentient, this being the large language model I'm communicating with. And an awful lot of the AI community came out and said, no, 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 no. And then he lost his job. All right. What does it mean to be sentient? Does it mean to actually have, and we'll just talk about human sentience because dogs have sentience and so do a number of other animals. What does it mean to have human sentience? Well, we perceive some other human as being sentient because of facial expressions that respond to things we have said or facial expressions we have made. We perceive them as being sentient because they seem to understand, and I'm going to put that in quotation marks because we don't always understand other humans, although we sometimes pretend to or figure it will sound better if I look as if I understood you, even though I don't. So we take these signs from another person to be reflective of what's actually going on in that person's head. And we do the same thing with using some of the newest versions of large language models. GPT-4 is probably the most sophisticated at this point. Is Claude 2 from Anthropic as sophisticated? You know, we could compare what Google has and what Meta has. They're all pretty darn good now. And part of the challenge for us is deciding what we care about in sentience. Do we care about behavior patterns? Or do we care about knowing it's genuine, it's authentic, this really came from a person? The models are getting better and better so that it's becoming really difficult to figure out whether text has come from a human or from a non-human. And by the way, roboticists have gotten really good at programming in emotional responses to things that are facial from a human being or things that are said from a human being. So wait a couple of years, and those robots are going to be just as scary as the text is in terms of saying, I don't know if this came from a person or not. I don't know if this thing I'm communicating with is sentient.
so we're really challenging the Turing test?
The Turing test has been passed. There's no question about it. So people are saying one of two things. Either the Turing test, it was the wrong test anyway, because we don't want to automate things. We want to think of artificial intelligence as being that which augments human abilities. It's a partnership. It's not a replacement model. The other way that people are now talking about the Turing test is, well, you want to test something else, because with language, at least in terms of written language, and by the way, spoken language, because Synthetic speech has gotten really good, and it's very, very difficult to know if it's a human or not a human who's speaking. Just ask all the actors who are on strike, right? Okay, but other people are saying, well, maybe what we should be testing is ability to do really well on standardized tests. Oops, GPT-4 can now best most humans on most tests. Well, maybe we want to think about tests of creativity. A recent study was just done on something called the Torrance test of creativity, which is an old test devised by psychologists to try to measure whether somebody is creative or not. And their test was to differentiate between, I'm not going to remember the term, but it's either disconnected or connected learning, and the real creativity. And the real question is, do you hone in on one creative concept, or do you have many different kinds of things you could come up with as ways of, say, using the standard example being a brick? How many things can you do with the brick? Well, I could put it onto my computer as a computer stand. I could throw it at someone. I could build a house with it. I could take some boards and bricks and pretend to build a bookcase when I was a student and didn't have money to buy real bookcases, and so forth. So that was a standard test, and there are pros and cons of it, but it's been a standard test around for a long time. Now, according to a recent study, one of the large language models can be more creative and think of more possible uses of, say, an everyday item than a human. So maybe that's not a great Turing test because, or maybe none of the standardized tests are great Turing tests. Maybe that's not what we want to measure. What do we want to measure? Artistic creativity? What are you going to do with Midjourney and DALL-E 3? They're getting darn good. What do you want to do with music? Some of the experiments with music, such as Beethoven's 10th Symphony, to take all of Beethoven's 9 symphonies, feed them in, and say, could you create a 10th symphony based on some outlines that Beethoven himself had done but died before he finished? If you listen to the symphony, it does not sound like Beethoven. I'm sorry. So for music, maybe there's hope. But if you want a Bach fugue, that's pretty easy to create because the template for what to use to write a fugue was fairly straightforward. And there have been so-called Turing tests for the Bach fugue. Did a human, did Bach create it? And some come out knowing and some don't. So it's really complicated to know what is it we want to use as a measure these days, because the standards we have set keep falling.
Interesting. Do you think we'll ever make it to the point where there is the AI capabilities of inventing new compositions as opposed to just modeling them off of others? I'm thinking, because I do this, of the end of Terminator 2. I know now why you cry. And for those of you who are not familiar with the director's cut of the film, there was a scene that was removed from the theatrical release where Sarah Connor turns on the learning chip in the Terminator's head. So when he says at the end, "I know now why you cry," it changes the meaning of that statement. With that scene, we see him learning how to be human. Without that, it's just like, oh, I've studied you, right? I understand you. Do you think we'll ever get to that point with AI as we know it in real life, as opposed to just our science fiction, where that kind of knowledge, right? I'm thinking a Turing test. No, where that kind of knowledge can be, and I'm going to use this term very loosely, organic to artificial intelligence.
This one needs a deep think on my part. Let's take music.
Mm.
You can use AI tools to create music that hasn't existed before. Can you use AI tools to join in a jazz riff, to riff off of the humans? I don't know, but I would not be surprised. And if it's not there because nobody has programmed it in, I bet you could. Um, As for the question of would you cry, let me give an analog. When digital books first started becoming common, at least in a number of countries, one of the questions that was asked was, if reading a digital book, would you ever cry? Could you get emotionally involved with pixels on a screen? At that point, let's just call it a Kindle, but it could have been a Kobo or whatever, or these days, a mobile phone. And there were people who said, no, this will never happen because there's so many affordances to print that add to the reading experience. There's the touch issue, there's the smell issue, there's holding the book, there's knowing where in the book you are. And I could go on and on and on. Well, these days I have lots of colleagues who say I can cry just as easily if I'm going to cry reading a digital book. But what we've done is we've set aside some of the affordances that we call upon, that we, quotes, naturally experience, having used print, at least in the Western world, in some way, shape, or form since the 15th century. And that becomes part of our definition of what reading is. Then the question becomes, if we know, and I think this is the important question, if we know that something has been created by artificial intelligence, do we turn off? And do we say, no, I'm not going to cry for you? But if we don't know, has the level of things that humans interpret to be creative, and I'm minding my words there in my caveats, if we see those things there and we do not know the source of the creation, what's going to stop us from crying?
That's interesting. It takes us back to Benjamin's aura. We find something sort of special and shiny in human creativity that we're not seeing in AI products.
Well, there are two ways to look at this notion of not seeing in AI products. As of right now, do the products of AI turn out to be as creative as what humans would come up with? Well, if you take something that you create on Midjourney and then tweak it a lot, which is what people have done, the level of creativity can be astounding, but there was some human intervention. If you say no humans allowed, only take what the AI can do, probably it's not going to measure up to the best of, however you want to define that, what humans can do. But the reason that I said a moment ago, we have to know whether something was created artificially or not, is humans have a great appreciation of, desire for, yearning for something that is authentic. You take artificial flowers versus real ones, and you don't have to water the ones that are artificial. And they may look really good, especially from a distance, like an impressionist painting. You have to put it back a ways before you can take in the aesthetics. But knowing that it's real has something else going for it. It's the same reason that people still pay to go to concerts. Whether they're rock concerts or whether they're classical concerts, people want to see human beings creating music, even though the recording that you may get could be superior quality to what, if you're sitting up in the equivalent of the nosebleed section, you're going to hear. But we want to hear something that's real. We want a real Oriental rug that costs 10, 100 times more than something that's machine made. We want those flowers. And we want to know that a human being wrote or drew or created as a movie something himself or herself. That is part of what our human experience of creativity is.
Wonderful. That actually helps me to contextualize some of my students' reactions to AI. So let's move to your book. Who wrote this? How AI and the Lure of Efficiency Threaten Human Writing. So I'm going to repeat that part of the title, The Lure of Efficiency. In the book, you draw a distinction between AI's role in the development of interactive fiction, narrative-based computer games, even auto-generated love letters,
Yes.
and of course, the kind of nonfiction writing tools that we use today for efficiency's sake, especially in journalistic practices, law, many professions that you outline in the book. Do you see the appeal of our ceaselessly seeking easier and more efficient ways of doing things as one of our biggest challenges that we as humans face at the dawn of the AI revolution? I know.
Efficiency is a really complex concept because, to some extent, why wouldn't you be more efficient on anything, on cleaning the floor, not on your hands and knees, but one of these, Swiffer mops? Why wouldn't you have automatic transmission as opposed to manual shifting? Why wouldn't you rely on spell check rather than having to know how to spell yourself? Why, if you're an indie author who produces a book every 6 weeks, wouldn't you rely on one of the generative AI programs to do some of the writing for you because your name is there and you're the one making the profit? Why wouldn't you? And the answer is as complex as the ways in which humans try or don't try to be efficient. Some of us enjoy cooking for ourselves. It's more efficient for me to go out to eat or order takeout. But there's an aesthetic that comes from doing something myself, from knowing that I could do this myself. A lot of us really started doing a whole lot of cooking of various cuisines we had never tried before during the pandemic. And we realized I could do this. I could learn something new and I could create something. Efficiency in writing is a slightly different issue from efficiency in certain other aspects of life. I'll start with the current state of affairs, which is more current than when my book was finished, which was basically March 2023. And since then, lots of other things have appeared. I think of GPT-4, which is now integrated and increasingly so into Microsoft products, which are doing more and more of the writing for you than they were 6 months ago, a year ago. Many tools, I think of Grammarly, which used to just say, oh, your grammar's wrong here, or you spelled this wrong, or your punctuation is wrong, or let's run this through some kind of a plagiarism check. These days suggests alternative ways of doing sentences. That maybe this is more powerful, maybe this is more subtle. And there are other tools that do the same sorts of things. To the extent we increasingly let these ever more modern versions of AI for writing do our editing as well as our writing, and the line between editing and writing is increasingly blurred, to the extent we increasingly say, let's just let the tools do it, I'm busy, or that's a pretty good way of saying things. One of the things I'm fond of saying is and indeed it's true, Microsoft spent $13 billion paid to OpenAI in order to integrate first GPT-3 and then GPT-4 into Microsoft products. When I use something like Microsoft Editor and it tells me that a word is sexist or a word is racist or something is not grammatically correct, if I'm not a really confident writer, I'm likely to say, well, for 13 billion, probably it knows more than me. I'll take what it says. Okay. So the problem is often it's wrong. Often it's dead wrong. And I had a lot of fun in the book finding places where it, in this case, Microsoft Editor, would recommend I would make a change. And had I made that change, it would have been really wrong. It recommends things having to do with inappropriate language, where it is inappropriate. The editor tool is inappropriate. And we're stuck a little bit because if we try to be efficient, we'll go with something that could be really wrong. It's also, in some cases, just not our style. It's not the way we speak. It's not the way we write. It's not who we are. So I take this efficiency issue and I turn it on its head a little bit. I look at some of the studies I did with university students in the United States and in other parts of the world, particularly in Italy, because I was teaching there in a summer school and I had a big population of students wanting to do my surveys. Students will tell you that when it comes to things such as predictive texting, which is more efficient than writing yourself, a lot of them say, I feel I didn't write this. This isn't mine. I want to do my own writing. I want my own voice to come through in what I write. So it's not that everybody who writes is looking for efficiency. At some point, one says, no, I don't think this is what I want. Um, Speaking of movies, there's a movie that you and your audience know, Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. And there's this lovely scene where poor hapless Charlie is strapped into a seat. And rather than give him a lunch break, because he's working in a factory, the food is brought and smacked to his mouth. Okay, is that more efficient? Well, he doesn't get a whole lunch break, but that's not a good way to eat. And I think, from my surveys and the people I talk with, some people, some of the time, are happy for the efficiencies of AI when it comes to editing and writing. And I suspect the same is going to be true when it comes to screenwriting, because you look at the settlements for the Screenwriters Guild, and AI can have a role. You just have to admit that AI came in, thank you. But other times people say, no, that's too far. At some point, I have to have me be in what I am creating, whether it's writing or whether we could talk about music, we can talk about art and so forth. That is, I do predict, or maybe that's a hopeful prediction, that there will be a certain amount of pushback as the tools become so powerful that the me, the human me, starts to recede.
We'll get into this a little bit later, but I'm already seeing that with my students. The vehemence with which they reject AI, they generally consider it cheating, and they'll use that word and they'll use it very strongly and accusationally. And I think it's because there is part of them that longs to discover their own voice.
Yeah.
But more about students a little bit later. I want to continue to talk about you. So you acknowledge the speed of discourse around AI and how quickly it shifts in tone and content, almost matching the speed with which technology is developed and implemented. You mentioned that even just in the short months since this book has been published, and I can't believe it was just published really just a few months ago. Um, so you've mentioned how some of the research on AI has changed. Has your thinking about AI changed at all? The way you personally are understanding it or seeing its place in our society?
Changed in the last 6 months
Yeah,
since
since publishing the book.
well, not since I published, since my editor said, basta, we're done, finished. We have to publish this thing and get it out now, which was basically March 2023. And then I must thank Stanford University Press. They published this in record time and did a wonderful job on it. Um, Interestingly, what has happened in those last 6 months, and I held my breath because if something brand new, really mind blowing came out, it wouldn't be in the book. What has happened is augmentation of the things that were already happening. So, ChatGPT, which came out when I thought I had finished the book, which was just before Thanksgiving 2022. And then ChatGPT came out, and I emailed my editor and I said, I have to make some changes. I have to add this in. Right. But the things that have happened since, we'll just call it March-ish, are the GPT, ChatGPT is now much more powerful than it was when it came out November 30th, 2022. GPT-4 has come out, and we have this label GPT-4, but there are many iterations of it, and it keeps getting tweaked. Besides the power of what it can write, and it's no longer generating text that is, some people have called it plain vanilla, some people have called it beige. It's sort of non-committal and doesn't have a lot of sophisticated language. That's easy now to fix if they want to fix it. An awful lot, no, an awful lot of effort. I won't say, I was going to say success, but an awful lot of effort has continually been put into trying to get rid of bias issues in racism, bias issues in sexism, and that's continuing to grow, but that's incremental rather than being whoosh, something brand new has happened. What has now started to happen, particularly with the with the graphic tools is artists are pushing back and they're suing. Whether they're suing OpenAI for DALL-E 2, but now they can sue for DALL-E 3, whether they're suing Stable Diffusion. They're saying, no, you can't do this, particularly if somebody is using my work and then making money off of it. And the real question, I think, with copyright, which is what we're getting into now with art and with text, is this fair use, or is it, and therefore in the public domain, or is it something that the originator has rights to? And OpenAI is, at least from what I read, cooperating with various image companies to try to make sure that creators of images are getting a fair share of royalties. Similarly, there are now, as I'm sure you and your audience know, lawsuits being waged by authors saying you cannot just take my text and feed it into your large language model and then have somebody come up with something that sounds a little bit like Margaret Atwood, but it isn't quite. Thank you. We don't know where those lawsuits are going to go. The intellectual property authors, intellectual property lawyers, who have written about this, the ones who know a lot about technology, are saying, this is not such an easy question to answer, because if it's produced by a machine, machines and the products of machines cannot hold copyright. So it's not clear what's going to happen. But somebody fed that stuff in, and so who do you sue, right? And that we don't have an answer to. So I think it's going to take many lawsuits. And as some people have joked, many lawyers putting their kids through college on the money they're making from those lawsuits. It's going to be a huge deal to figure out where things stand in terms of who owns what. And that is a change that has ramped up and will continue to ramp up in the coming months.
It's not entirely dissimilar to the conversations about plagiarism that we have in academia surrounding ChatGPT. Probably a bit easier for us in academia because we can just say, any work that is not your own.
Right. Although it's complicated. So not your own. What does that mean? If I write something and I put it through, whether it's ChatGPT or whether it's some other tool to spiff up my language, especially if I'm a non-native speaker of the language that I'm going to, let's say, publish in or hand in a school paper for, is that cheating? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. I interestingly got an email letter from the publisher Elsevier a couple of months ago. I review manuscripts that are submitted to journals that are published by Elsevier, and it said, take note, when you write a review for a manuscript submitted to an Elsevier journal, you must write the review yourself. You may not let a large language model write it for you, okay? Because these large language models can, quotes, read the text and then write a review. Okay, so plagiarism, what does this mean? It has many different manifestations. I will note that one of my colleagues at the School of Education at Stanford University has just done a study where he's compared high school students' reports on, oh yeah, I plagiarized, I took something from the internet, or I borrowed from a friend, or whatever it was. This was pre ChatGPT, and probably people weren't using some of the other generative tools that were out there then. And he's compared that with students who are now high school students again, who are reporting they have used ChatGPT to cheat. And the numbers are really not particularly different. It's not a really carefully controlled study because it's different students and different times and whatever. But my hunch is that what you just said earlier about your students saying that's cheating is the students who are going to find a way around will find some tool, and maybe it's an AI tool, or maybe it's paying someone, or maybe it's filtering something from the internet. But the ones who aren't are probably not going to. Mm-hmm. And the ones who almost 99 times out of 100 would not, But occasionally they're so strapped for time because they just, they broke up with their significant other the day before the paper was due, and just this once, probably they would use generative AI just this once too. So I'm less worried about it than people were come January, February, and March, that everybody's going to cheat.
Yeah, it seems like for that to change, we have to change. And so the tools have changed, whether you're using Wikipedia or SparkNotes or ChatGPT 4,
Right.
um, or right as you say, those who are going to do it are going to do it regardless of the tools, and those who are not going to do it are not going to do it regardless of the tools or that lure of efficiency.
Right. Now, that is in part a prediction, in part a hope, just as some of my other predictions come hopes. But what is clear, particularly in the educational field, is we need to be much, much smarter about the writing assignments that we make. I have no problem with making an assignment that says, have a generative AI tool write something. That's the assignment. And I want to see what it wrote, I, the teacher. And then I want to see what your agreements, what your disagreements are with it. Similarly, I have no problem with you having an assignment where you must write something yourself. And if you have to prove that by sitting in the classroom and taking a pen to a piece of paper, which actually has all kinds of benefits, but that's a different conversation. And then say, run, now you get to type it up and run it through ChatGPT or whatever tool you want and see what the differences are. What are the edits? Why do you think those edits were made? Having those conversations, I don't have a problem with. What I do have a problem with is as faculty members, not making clear what the rules of the road are. So there are all kinds of people in the education field who are very conflicted what to do. There are law schools, such as the University of Michigan, that has said, if you're applying to our school, to our law school, you must write the essay yourself. QED. If you're at, I think it's Arizona State, it's definitely in the state of Arizona, you may have a generative AI tool, right? It's okay. We've got to get this cleared up because people are very conflicted. Most university faculty at this point have heard of all this generative AI stuff, but don't know very much about it, don't know how it works, don't know how much their students are or not using it. And they're very confused, and I empathize. And lots of universities are running little crash courses for faculty, but it takes a while to learn how all this stuff works. And there's going to be a lot of confusion for some time to come.
And the tools that we use currently to moderate it are not wonderful. I've certainly heard stories about colleagues putting pieces of writing that students have said were generated by ChatGPT into Zero GPT and getting back a 100% student written or 100% human written. And then the opposite, of course, happens.
Okay, so let's talk about these tools for detecting whether an AI did it or not. GPT-0 is probably the most sophisticated of the tools out there now, and it's being incorporated into all kinds of learning management systems and so forth. And okay, you're talking now with a person who does not believe that Turnitin should be used by any university. I think that's a violation of student privacy. And I think either you trust or you don't trust. But better still, you get to know your students and their writing style, or don't bother giving a 10-page paper to 100 students and assume that you can do something meaningful in your interpretation of it. Okay. But let's look at the question of whether we can devise GPT, AI detection tools that are successful, that don't falsely accuse students or falsely exonerate students. If you talk with the people who are the lead AI researchers in developing these kinds of things, or trying them out to see can they break them, can they jailbreak them, the AI researchers will basically tell you it's a fool's errand. You will not be able to do this as the GPTs is what a number of us now call the whole series. As they become whichever big tech company has created them. As the GPTs get more and more sophisticated, it's going to be impossible. And I don't care what Edward Ten, who's a really well-meaning creator of GPT-0, the detection tool, when he was still a student at Princeton, I don't care what he says. This is not a game we're eventually going to win. So what we've got to do is ask, how do you think about assignments? And this is something I've actually written something about for the Chronicle of Higher Education, to say we've got to rethink what we mean by writing. And if we don't do this, shame on us. And it serves us right if we can't figure out who wrote this from a student assignment.
Love that. Let's stay on writing for a moment. Several times throughout the book, you ask your readers to consider what writing skills are worth keeping,
Right.
sort of as we enter into this new world. And I find this very intriguing because it suggests that there are some skills or rules, perhaps, that are expendable, or maybe anachronistic to where we are as a writing culture now. Can you tell us a little bit about those skills that you see worthy of preservation and which we might want to leave in the past where maybe they belong?
Okay. Let me start with spelling, because spell check has been with us actually long before there was Microsoft spell check. There was spell check on mini computers back in the 70s. I mean, they existed. Okay, not that many
The
people.
late 80s, early 90s, I had this little yellow thing. The
Right.
problem is you had to know how to spell the word.
Right. All right. Um, so I asked students, both in the U.S. and especially in Italy, do you think that kids should still learn to spell? And I asked them if they thought their spelling had gotten better or worse because of spell check. Interestingly, most people in the US, and we'll just call it Italy, there were some other European countries, but largely Italy, said, yes, it's very important that people learn to spell. I was surprised Americans said that to the tune they did. I was surprised how many Americans said spell check helps make me a better speller. Well, the question that I asked was, are you a better speller on your own? Not in the paper that comes out, because spell check did the correction for you. But I don't think that some of those people doing my survey saw the distinction between spell check cleaned it up and I would know how to spell myself. But if you ask people what they think they would like as spelling, many people, I think, have it as an aspiration that spelling is a good thing to know. And that's great. Do I think they practice what they preach? No. Okay. Do I believe that knowing how to spell is important? Yes, because it empowers you to know what a word is. It empowers you. I see some books on your shelf. Are those the Loeb Classical Library?
Yes, they are.
Right. So there's some Latin and some Greek, right? Because the Latin is red and the Greek is green. If I have it right. Knowing what a word is made up of, knowing its etymology is knowing the word. And you're not going to do that if you just say, spell check, clean this up for me. All right. Do I believe knowing punctuation is important? Well, there are many different styles of punctuation. They differ from country to country. Do I think they're useful? To know, yes, in part, because when I rely on when I look at, I don't rely on, when I look at what Microsoft Word tells me should be correct punctuation, often it's wrong. So I would like to be able to know what the rules, at least for American English, are for punctuation. For grammar, if I make a mistake, I don't mind knowing it's a mistake. But I do believe I have to know grammar to know you're right, you Microsoft editor. I have to know that it's a mistake. And going back to something I said previously, if a tool such as Grammarly cleans it all up, without my actually knowing what's right or wrong, I'm never going to learn, and I don't know what I should trust. So I now eliminated an awful lot of writing to just hand over to the tools. The next thing is style. There are not all kinds of tools now. One of the ones that was available earlier is called WordTune, that would say, do you want this to be a formal style? Do you want this to be informal? Do you want this to sound very friendly? I mean, what would you like? And it will just change the style of all your sentences. Well, what happened to humans knowing how to do this? Because if I rely on a tool, I won't, number one, have to read a lot of different things, which is how we learn to write. You ask any writer, how did you learn to write? almost all of them will tell you by reading a lot. Okay. So, what's the motivation for reading if you care about writing? Because the AI is going to take over for me. And that disempowers us because our language, and now I'll speak as a linguist and I'll speak about our speech, and now I can speak about writing, it empowers us. And reading what others have written empowers us to think and feel different, talk about being sentient. Um, and if we abandon that, we're the losers. So would I like to abandon something? Probably not. Are there some things I could let go of when I'm in a hurry? Yes. I mean, do I sometimes let the predictive texting in email just finish a sentence for me if I don't really care whether I use this word or that word? I've been known to do that. I don't do it often, but I've been known to do that. That doesn't bother me because it's a one off. It's something we don't particularly put a lot of stake in. If I'm writing to a friend, I will change it and put back what I want because I owe it to that friend. I owe it to the friendship.
I love that. There's this sort of beautiful, beautiful rhetorical promise that we make when we write to someone, when we communicate with someone, and to that inclination to want to follow through on that promise with authenticity is quite beautiful.
Well, I believe in it and I most of the time practice it.
I seem to remember grammar check on Microsoft Word several years ago, maybe a decade. I don't know. Time gets all
It's been a grammar and style check has been around for a long
yeah.
time, and it just got more sophisticated.
Well, it used to my if my memory is correct, tell you what was wrong, sentence fragment, right? Because I'm fairly certain that's where I picked up some of my grammar knowledge was having to then look up what that meant and to learn how to fix it because it wasn't fixing it for you. It was just telling you what was wrong. Um,
You have a good memory, and Grammarly, at least in the free version, I haven't paid for premium. I cannot tell a lie. Or maybe it's in premium and I at least have read about it. I can't tell you which. But Grammarly has a tool that will tell you with a nice grammatical explanation for why it wants you to make the change. That's great. And what I can bet a fair amount of money on is non-native speakers, in this case of English, because Grammarly only is available in English now, they will read those descriptions and benefit from them. I do not believe that most of the students that I teach bother looking and they just say, fix it, just wake me when it's over. Similarly, spell check used to say, this is the right correction. Do you want to make it? And you'd have to okay each correction. And most of us who were bad spellers, and I happen to be one of them, um, would say, I'm sure you're right. Because unless it was a homonym and they got the wrong one, because either I had mistyped something or I really didn't spell it right, I recognized the word as being right. I said, phew, thank you. Take it. But now the auto spell correct is the default feature. And it just goes and does the corrections, poof, before you knew it. So you don't even get to contemplate, did I make a mistake? So if I have a typo, it will finish the word correctly spelled. Most of the time, it will get the right word. So I don't even get to contemplate that I've made a mistake, either in typing or in knowing how to spell the word. I find this to be problematic. Standardized spelling did not enter the English language in full bloom until about the beginning of the 1800s, late 1700s. Before that, it was scattershot. and that's a long, complicated story. Are we going to go back to that? No, because spell check is going to clean things up for us. But we may not know how to spell. We may not appreciate the richness of a word. We may not pause over a word and say, you know what? I hadn't thought about why that's spelled the way it is. I wonder if that word comes from Greek.
mhm.
Probably Attic Greek. I hadn't thought about that before. And that's part of knowing your language. And I believe we are richer people to have richer control over our language.
Hmm. Language is power. It's an incantation. It's a spell. It creates reality. It's a wonderful thing to have control over. I famously, for the reason that you pointed out, not looking to see what spell check was actually telling me and just trusting it, famously had in my clause on my syllabus about common courtesy, I demanded that we all curtsy to each other, treat people with curtsies. And for a semester, students would enter and leave my class with curtsy. It was a funny one, but we've seen that happen, to great detriment. Now, spell check, or at least the version we have through the university on Microsoft Word, defines the terms when it gives you the alternatives,
Really?
which is lovely because I don't make the mistakes like that again. Where it infuriates me, the autocorrect is, as you pointed out, my Greek and Latin books, when I'm working on a bilingual piece
Yeah.
and it changes my Latin to English.
Yes.
And I don't always notice before it
Yes.
goes to a publisher. And that is terrifying.
That's a problem.
Yes, that is a problem. So we've sort of talked a lot about some of these problems, big ones, small ones, everything from humorous typos in a syllabus to the loss of control over language and losing something in that power, um, which is, I think, has always been important, but maybe of increasing importance to have a certain understanding, a powerful understanding of language. But what about the benefits of AI? Do you see any real tangible benefits to this technology? And are there steps beyond sort of a species wide honor code that we can to take to get there?
All right. AI has all kinds of benefits. Let me start with the ones that have nothing to do with writing. If you look at what astounding work is being done in biology with AI tools, you take the notion of protein folding, understanding what our proteins are made up of, and they're all enfolded in themselves, and it's a very time-consuming process to figure out what they're made up of, because understanding that is understanding not just the human body, but understanding how one might derivatively cure diseases. I mean, there's an incredible amount of good stuff that can be done in fields that we don't think about being AI fields, but you can apply AI to. AI can do a very good job of reading mammograms. So when I go to have a mammogram done, I'm told, I'm asked, would you pay the $40 to have AI read it, or do you want the old-fashioned version? Well, after AI reads it, a human then checks it, but AI can find things that humans miss. And you need the human to augment what the AI is doing, but I'm willing to spend the $40. Okay. In terms of writing, there's a certain amount of writing that I don't mind AI doing in principle if I know why I'm doing it. So take the notion of writing an abstract of 50 articles that don't have to happen to have abstracts written of them. If they have an abstract written, I will probably read what I assume, but I could be wrong, a human wrote, because computers, since the late 1950s, have been writing abstracts for technical articles. Okay. But if I'm not going to read those 50 articles, if I'd say I just can't read them, I'm sorry, but I could read an abstract. I could decide whether I want to read the article or not. It is also the case that some people write terrible abstracts that don't really tell me what the article is about. And I would rather have an AI give it a try, because probably that author would get a better shot at my reading his or her article if there were a better abstract. Okay, but one place that's both a love-hate relationship is use of AI for translation. There are all sorts of things written in languages that I don't read that I would love to read. I just did an interview with a journalist in Slovenia that's going to come out in a couple of days, and it's going to be in Slovenian, and I can't read it, but I'm going to make a copy of it. I'm going to put it in Microsoft Translator, which will take large documents, unlike Google Translate, and then I can read it for research purposes. My German is a little rusty. If I actually want to get from a technical article a good translation, at least a reasonable translation, it's golden to me. If I'm traveling in Iceland and I cannot read the menu, I put my phone up and I know what I'm ordering. And it's not whale blubber, please. Okay. So there are places it can be useful, but when there's the flip side, namely professional translators who really do a very different kind of job in translating, particularly for literature or for things that may be informational texts but have a literary cast to them. You want a human translator there, but people who are commissioning translations, particularly information in the information world, you take law firms, you take accounting firms, they're all using commercial translators because it's cheaper. And then you may hire humans to do post editing, but post editing isn't a very intellectually exciting job, and it doesn't let you call upon your knowledge of the two languages in any serious way. And it's a deadening job. And you interview people who are professional translators, and they'll tell you they hate doing it, but they do it because those are some of the only jobs available. But the other thing they tell you, and this also goes for people doing regular writing, where they have used something like ChatGPT to generate something, and they say, well, I'll just edit it, right? I'll make it mine. What the translators will tell you is that if the translation has been done by a machine, there's very little motivation to make changes. It's just, the heck with it, leave it. And it's the same kind of things that humans are doing, given the opportunity to edit something that, in this case, a GPT generated. If they're given the opportunity to edit, often they'll say, no, it's fine. Now, this is under experimental situations. It's not that they're turning it into a professor for grading. Well, they say, it's okay. No, just lure of efficiency. It's fine, leave it. Okay. Why put more effort into it? So there are the pluses and minuses to the things that I think AI can do. There's some realms where we know they can only help humans. There are others where we have to be very mindful of what decisions we make as to how much help we want.
Interesting. It having used translator apps in all of the different ways that you described, I feel very invested in your answer. Now, do you think this brings us back to the creativity question? So, as we've noticed, my Latin and Greek, I do translate a lot of Latin poetry for my own scholarship. And even as I was getting my PhD, I didn't see the point. Right? Can't I just use translations? And I was told no. So I had to learn Latin in order to do my scholarship correctly, but I have come around to agreeing with them. What has struck me as the joy of translating Latin is the puzzle element, the context, that one word can actually mean all of these different things. And it's your job as the translator, based on clues you get in terms of tone, context, in terms of Ovid, perhaps a word that comes up in book 14 that was used in book 2, right?
Yeah.
And that ability to look back and think about what's changed, what hasn't changed, why the same word or the same phrase. Um, at least for right now, that kind of translation seems squarely in the sort of creative ken of the human, not the AI. I'm thinking an article I read a few years ago about differing translations of Dr. Zhivago. One got the language right, one got the literature right, but neither are right, is sort of what I had read. Are we going to get there? Do you think, I should say, because you are not a prophet, but do you think we're going to get there where I know I've kind of asked this in a different way earlier, but where AI is able to read, right? You've said several times in the book, and I think any of us who have read anything written by AI kind of see the lack of context, that they can't put the puzzle together. but they can translate one-to-one language. This is why Google Translate for Latin is abysmal.
Right.
And probably other languages, but why I can hold my phone up to a menu, when I'm traveling in a language I don't know and order, not whale blubber, as you say.
Right. But one of the problems with holding your phone up, which I have done in Iceland, actually, in Reykjavik, is what is my motivation to even learn some basic Icelandic? I'm in the country. I'm in a different place. I'm in a place with a radically different history, a history of democracy in its own version that goes back many, many centuries, not as far as Greece, but many centuries. It's a different, it's a moonscape landscape in so many ways. You'd think that I would do something to become part of this. And the motivation for learning foreign languages is in the basement. If you look at the statistics that I think will soon be published by the Modern Language Association on the reduction in the number of people signing up for college level foreign language classes, it is falling by 10, 20, 30, 40%, 50% if you go back about 3 or 4 decades. Mm. Who bothers, right? So who bothers to get to know what people are like? Because you get to know people by being able to talk with them, not by I hold my phone and you hold your phone and the phones talk with each other. So that's a problem that worries me. As for translating literature, there's a reason that different people translate the classics over and over again, because you put something of your style into them. And it's like Shakespearean plays. Not everything is put in Elizabethan dress, because people who are directors want the audience today, and whether it's a stage play or whether it's a movie, they want people of today's audience to feel connected. So how do you feel connected? And now going back to translation, by modernizing things in a way that your audience can resonate with in a way they didn't. Now I'll take Beowulf, which has dozens of translations. When Beowulf was first translated, whenever the heck that was, from Old English, aka Anglo-Saxon, to, we'll call it modernish English, it was a different world, and people had different reference points, and people used different vocabulary that we wouldn't use today. So I don't see that disappearing, but I see it being something we need to hold on to. I am thrilled that when books that I've written are translated into other languages, they're translated by human beings, not by AI.
Well, let's hope they always are. So what advice do you have for student writers trying to find their voice and perspective in this brave new world of AI generated text? What do you think they should avoid, and where might they actually want to experiment?
The first thing I would recommend, and no, I am not a troglodyte, is to do some writing by hand. I've done studies, again, in the US and largely in Italy, with how people feel about writing by hand versus writing on a keyboard. And that's not an AI question per se, but some of the answers they give about what they derive from writing by hand are very similar to the answers they give about writing their own text messages as opposed to relying on predictive texting, or wanting to write a question that I asked this last summer of some graduate students in Italy. What would you not want ChatGPT to write? Love letters, poems, anything that takes analytic abilities. They're saying, I want to do this myself. So go back to handwriting. What students have told me over and again, I've done earlier studies with a colleague in Australia, is when I write by hand, I think more than when I write with my hands at a keyboard. I pause, I reflect, I think about something I wrote a while ago, and I don't do that nearly as much when I'm writing with a keyboard. So the first thing I would suggest to students, and I think about Bard College, where I was lecturing a number of months ago, people people carry a commonplace book or carry, paper, and they write by hand a lot because it stimulates thinking. It really does. Okay, so that's the first thing I would do. Then I would ask, what is it that you want from an AI tool? I mean, sit down. It's just you, yourself, and you. Nobody is testing you. No teacher is saying, oh, you cheated. What is it you want? What do you have any aspirations whatsoever to write? I'm not talking about writing so that you win a Pulitzer or a Nobel Prize in literature. I'm saying, what, as you go forward in life, do you think you might like be able to do with your writing? And then I would reflect back on the writing that you did in some version of freshman comp, English comp, whatever the required course was early in your career, where people took, whoever was teaching your course in all likelihood, took a lot of effort with you to look at multiple drafts. What did you learn from doing those multiple drafts? So if you're in a course where you're not asked for multiple drafts, would you do them yourself? How would you benefit? Maybe you could ask your professor, would you be willing to look at a draft and comment? I know it takes time, but even just a couple of comments would help me. Could I come to your office hours? We could sort of scan through it together. You have to encourage this kind of behavior because professors are busy and don't always encourage it themselves. So I would also say, ask what your goals are and what can you do to help achieve them, particularly in your student days. And then you know what? Even after you stop being a student, you could do more than one draft of something because chances are somebody will call you on it if you don't write well. And don't just turn to Grammarly. And lots of professionals just turn to Grammarly. They're losing out. I don't mind you using Grammarly, but look and see what it suggests. Read those grammatical recommendations and ask, do I agree? Do I not agree? You're not supposed to begin a sentence with a conjunction. I'm sorry. That's what I learned, a million years ago when I learned how to write. But it is now a powerful way of writing. Figure out what your writing style is. E. E. Cummings didn't have to capitalize. It was okay.
That's wonderful advice. Before we get to my last question for you, do you have any questions for me? So, as someone who's currently working in college writing as well as literature and visual culture, is there anything about my experience with students submitting to or combating this lure of efficiency about which you're curious or that might help you in future research?
Sure. You invited. What is it your students tell you they appreciate most from you teaching them writing?
I think for them, there's a lot of anxiety built up in writing. And part of what we deal with in college writing is the transition from the 5 paragraph essay to original thought, to really that finding your voice, putting the pieces together in a way that is uniquely you. Right? We can all write about the same subjects, but we're going to approach them very differently. And that's one of the where word choice, I think, is so precious to the author. And why, the some of those translation apps are the most annoying. I think I have one student who has openly admitted to using ChatGPT. Most recently, he said for his college application essay. I don't know what our rules are about that. I will not mention his name just in case. But
There
he
weren't rules yet.
Huh? Yes, this is true because he was applying last year. He did say he had to go through and fix all of the mistakes.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a very interesting word, but when I asked him what they were, he couldn't really articulate.
Okay.
Um, we were reading a piece as a class, Vahini Vara's Ghosts. It's beautiful. She uses GPT-3, I think, to help write about her sister's death. But
Yeah.
there's one passage that we got stuck on that had nothing to do with grief. It was about running. And the I in the story, which this was a part written by the chatbot, went from Battery Park across the George Washington Bridge, up the Palisades. Well, actually, it would be down the Palisades, up under the George Washington Bridge. You're going the wrong way. Um, Back across the George Washington Bridge. Okay, wait. So this is actually really problematic now. Back to Battery Park. It was a 5K and took 33 minutes. Now, anyone who is familiar with New York knows that this is not possible to do in 30 minutes. I even have a runner in that class, in one of my classes, who said he can do a 5K in less than 33 minutes, but that's not a 5K, that's 23.5 miles. Um, but we had spoken earlier in the semester about certain AI that don't understand the concept of legs and instead build towers and fall.
Right.
And my students, being brilliant and remembering this TED talk that we had watched, said maybe that's how it's processing this. But these are the kinds of mistakes that we have to clean up as humans, right? AI that's not bound to our laws of physics doesn't think about movement the same way we do. Why would it? So those kinds of mistakes, the students said he had to go back through and clean up. When I asked him later, when it was just the two of us during my office hours, why he used it for such an important piece of writing, he said that he was afraid that he doesn't know how to write an essay like that. This is something we're used to hearing. We want them to start thinking in their essays. The 5-paragraph essay doesn't want that. So what I'm finding is that lore of ChatGPT is less about the lore of efficiency, although we do deal with that. Why do I need to know how to write? Right? If I'm in the STEM subjects. And I always whisper grant applications in their ear. But
Grant
why?
applications can now be written by GPTs, but go
Oh,
on. I'm sorry.
wonderful.
I'm sorry.
Wonderful, wonderful. So there's that lore of why do I need to know this when I can outsource it? But more commonly, what I'm seeing, especially in those students who think GPT is cheating and will say so with vehemence, is the anxiety of writing, of the vulnerability of authentic writing. And that is what I have seen as the most common lore is really that I'm not ready. I don't know enough. What right do I have at 18 to a voice? Which is fascinating in and of itself.
And I would like to believe that we could figure out a better way starting in middle school and high school to empower people to find their voice, to not figure we have to put a grade on everything, but to say, write what's interesting to you. I mean, we found this out with assigned books for high school students. A lot of high school students hate the books they're assigned, but if you say, read anything, I mean, anything you want, as long as you're reading, a lot of them start loving to read. So we have to rethink what this pedagogy is for, and grading is probably one of the worst things that we do to students. Whether it's necessary or not is a new conversation.
I think it's one of the worst things we do to ourselves. The stacks just get bigger and
It's
bigger.
also that.
Well, as I'm going to echo something that one of the film festival committee members said earlier in an email, this book really changed the way I think about assigning writing. And I have a new class that's about to start this week. I was just tinkering with the syllabus and I changed the writing prompts. Um, and to, instead of write about this piece that I gave you, into weekly reflections, write about anything we discussed this week that interests you. So thank you for that, because I am really looking forward to seeing the outcomes.
Good luck.
Thank you. One more question for you. As part of a film festival, this interview is part of a festival that engages deeply with film. What is your favorite film about AI and why?
This is going to be a really long pause. And it's going to be a really long pause because I probably don't have an answer because I haven't seen enough films. I know about them and I've seen pieces of them, but I probably, this is a big embarrassment, but here we have it. The best I can muster is there was an article, I think it was in the New York Times, maybe 2 weeks ago, it was either the Washington Post or the New York Times, on the best 10 AI movies that have been made. So I figured I better quickly read these descriptions of the movies. And I said, I could watch those, right? But when I relax, I read. I don't go to the movies much. And since the pandemic, I have not been to a movie, immunocompromised and all that good stuff. And when I go to see a movie, I haven't gone to see much sci-fi or haven't watched, and I watch almost no television except the news. So I'm the wrong person to ask, but you're going to entice me with this festival to make, to make amends for my evil ways and to watch some really good stuff.
Well, we have 6 beautiful films, and you can find the screening schedule down in the comments for this video. 6 beautiful films that look at different facets of AI, from falling in love with one to fighting for your life against them, to becoming an unwilling part of them. So please do join us.
Inspired now. I'm inspired.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining me and Dr. Naomi S. Barron, author of Who Wrote This? How AI and the Lure of Efficiency Threaten Human Writing. And please join us for the rest of the film festival, November 2nd through 5th, 2023. And again, that information is below. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking.